Welcome back to the Wagon Box podcast. I'm here at the Wagon Box with Daniel Miller. He just flew in and we've had wonderful conversations up till now. He is an editor at IM 1776. He's done a lot of things, traveled a lot, and been involved in various writing and art projects. He was somewhat canceled in the early days of 2017. And anyway, it's been an interesting ride, sounds like. And we were talking about, as we are wont to do here, the West, the trajectory of Europe and America, but also one idea that you mentioned that really caught my attention was the idea of cultural spaces. Unpack that for me, because I felt like it connected with what we're trying to do here at the Wagon Box, like creating a cultural space. And you're saying that culture is basically, what did you say, something about the interplay of spaces?
I said it's a system of spaces.
System of spaces.
I think that the question of culture is one which is being posed with increasing urgency these days, because we've obviously just won this big victory in the US with Trump's election. And as a consequence, we're forced to consider how our tactics and strategies and even our ideas will need to change, because for a long time we've basically just been kind of opposing enemy, let's say, in the context of a culture war.
Sure.
And the big slogan was, politics is downstream from culture.
From culture, right? And when you say we, you're just talking about this broad coalition of sort of everything from the anti-woke to right-wing, new right. I mean,
in fact, I would say it would be a we that's precisely formed by its opposition,
right,
rather than having an internal consistency necessarily. It was clear to many people from different perspectives that it was necessary to try to do something politically to end this situation.
The cathedral, the regime, all that, sure.
Yeah, however you want to define it. And of course, indeed, like how one defines it also to some extent shapes what one thinks about it. And this is, the classic connection between language and politics, but I mean, I don't know, maybe that's kind of opening a door, which is
enough for another time.
Yeah.
So you're saying that for so long there's this coalition of people that's against this. They had this common enemy, the regime, this sort of, I don't know, what would we in one sentence sort of describe what collapsed?
Well, I think the regime is, it's generally a good term. I mean, it comes from Aristotle, ultimately, who conducts regime analysis in the politics. And it is not just the government, it's the whole system of political matter, which is kind of brought into play. So, I mean, a lot of people are confused on this point, and you can have frustrating conversations with, I would say, like more, I don't know, like self-affirmed centrists who conceive of politics still as a sort of contest between, the left and the right, for example, or the Democrats and the Republicans. But it's not really that straightforward, actually. The regime is something which is also vertical in a way, and it reaches down and across society in a very structural form. So it's to do with how, like I said, political matter or social matter is kind of shaped and organized in order to create a collective structure that then enables some sort of coordination to take place across society. And so that is what basically has now ended, I think. Like what that was, you can say, well, on the one hand, it was a sort of commitment to a kind of progressive liberalism. I think it was really the last phase of that kind of liberal ideology, and it was sort of liberalism degraded actually really into something very cynical, almost just kind of a collection,
kind of a parody of itself,
collection of slogans rather than really a vision. Actually, I think that you can see there's a big difference between the kind of, even if one is necessarily not in favor of it, but the difference between the kind of liberalism that was actually quite confident
Sure.
and in a way optimistic,
Sure.
which sort of existed at the beginning of the 20th century. And then
Sure.
the kind of liberalism that we have seen in the last 10 years, which is really just like considered phenomenologically, just like a very kind of broken structure, which was sort of organized around these particular symbols and in fact also these kinds of particular spaces, so it was very thin in this respect. It was to do with, like when one thinks of in particular liberal political spaces, and one thinks also of safe spaces was a kind of concept that was developed, like a notion of like extreme risk aversion. On the other hand, also kind of coupled with a kind of ultra-violence, actually, that was sort of, I don't know, leak out in certain strange ways through sort of cancellation rituals, like a very tense, anxious kind of, homogenous, actually, and homogenizing. This is the sort of the famous trope of the globo homo, which is actually not anything really to do with the homo per se. It's to do with the sort of spread of, exactly, like the kind of
groupthink,
the fact that you can get the same coffee in Singapore or in Sheridan.
Sure. So what you're saying, going back to these spaces and the current political environment, is now that whatever that was that you've described has somewhat collapsed, and we have a new coalition taking over. There's questions about, instead of being this sort of united in opposition, now we have to build something.
Well, I think just to sort of pause a little while longer on the question of collapse and how it collapsed and what that really means, because if you consider really the sort of the function of culture from a political point of view and of cultural spaces, broadly defined. So let's extend that also to, let's say, educational spaces.
Sure.
The point is ultimately to produce the governing class of society. That's the function of culture from a political point of view. And so what you really want to do is to have a system which is able to promote people into positions of power, where they're then sufficiently able, because they've trained their senses, to perceive correctly what's a good idea and what's a bad idea, because they're making decisions that are very consequential for now in the age of the globalization, millions, hundreds of millions of people. And that is something that requires a certain kind of temperament, a certain kind of character, a certain kind of intelligence. And it was very clear, I think, in the last 2 years that the people who have somehow assumed the role of the elite in our society are very mediocre. Like, they're not really...
And maybe even celebrated their mediocrity.
Well, I think...
Some of them.
I think that, in a way, you had a certain kind of mediocre conspiracy, or like a conspiracy of the mediocre, because it's also true that people who are, let's say, they have a little bit of animal cunning, I suppose they did excel at that, but they were able to recognize also threats to, it's like in an artistic or a cultural context, like let's say part of some sort of, very mediocre cultural sphere, then you will actually work very systematically to exclude any acts of genius that are occurring side by side, because it makes you look very bad by comparison. This is also why I think they were kind of looking to sort of cancel elements of history in a certain way. They want to shrink the comparison space to make basically any kind of objective analysis of really like how historically shoddy they are, impossible to achieve, right? So in other words, the system collapsed before it was pushed over. It was drained of vitality and of quality, and it started generating, in terms of its social and psychological production, extremely non-functional products, which have been very detrimental politically to the West. And it was the same in the United States, and I think especially in Europe, this whole governing class of people who really have no business, like running a hot dog stand, actually, these kinds of technocrats speaking and thinking through this just really denuded and empty kind of phraseology that makes it impossible for them to govern effectively. So what we need to restore is some kind of a cultural system or form or structure that then is going to be able to, how to put it, somehow train and enhance and
Funnel people,
promote
yeah.
the best aspects in human culture and put them into positions where they're able to demonstrate their qualities.
And you think that's done through cultural spaces?
I would say that this is how it's done. Yeah, I mean, it is how it's done.
Sure.
I mean,
Now, do you think there's any sort of rescuing the traditional cultural spaces, which would be sort of universities and institutions like that? Or do you think it's more a matter of building parallel cultural spaces like the Wagon Box or other sort of new concepts and new institutions that can kind of fill that role?
well, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think from, my first instinct is to say, well, ultimately, you're not really going to just want to leave these very important historically institutions to just nothing. I
Sure.
mean, you want to reclaim them, actually.
Sure.
However, there's a bigger issue ultimately, which is to do with the nature of social change, how technology is also driving social change.
Sure.
The university was originally a medieval institution, which in a way changed form as it entered modernity. I mean, the initial curricula of universities were theology,
Sure.
ultimately, and
Well,
subsequently,
yeah.
it was theology, medicine, and law.
Sure.
Were in Bologna, I think,
Sure.
the first faculties. They then took on this kind of political status project with the birth of the nation state. Now they are somehow organs of a certain kind of global progressivism. And like I said, they're not doing very well. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah, I mean, right now the subject matter is actually less relevant at all. Doesn't really matter. What they're producing is a sort of cultural formation of a sort of lingo and a sort of, these liberal sensibilities that they're trying to, it seems to me, because it doesn't really, that seems like whether you get a degree in communications or women's studies or, whatever, post-colonial, theory.
Well, I think they were basically training cadres to form elements in the regime. I mean, this
Sure.
is, they became ideological factories. I mean, in the same way that universities in the Soviet Union,
Sure.
ultimately turned themselves over to this kind of ideological instruction.
Is there, I guess, so we're talking about what we can do in the wake of that. Now, obviously, that hasn't disappeared by any means, but it's definitely lost it's lost a lot of its stronghold. But in replacing that or in reforming, reforming, what we're discussing, are we reforming or replacing? And my also thought is like, what's the risk of replacing that with something that's better, but still sort of a obnoxious version of sort of some sort of right wing, group thinky thing of its own.
Well, I mean, I think that probably we need to be realistic about our true position, let's say. I mean, actually, neither you nor I, or even us together, are in the position today to revolutionize Harvard. I mean, maybe that's a project that could be launched from somewhere. And
Sure.
I think maybe it's something that should be developed as a kind of vision. But I think from a more grassroots level, then there is opportunity to create something on the ground that people can make things. I think that in terms of the history of cultural change, I think usually that is something that happens from the bottom up.
Sure.
So the question would be to understand, let's say, what kinds of men do we want to produce, for example? Like, what kinds of cultural elements do we want to emphasize? How do we want to train people's senses, even,
Sure.
in order to become more sensitive and acute? I think that we saw, or we're seeing now, like the limitation of certain sort of cultural spaces emerged in response to the ultimately totalitarian pretensions of the regime. What we saw then was a kind of necessity to adopt a kind of ironic posture against the sort of, very unironic and, extremely dogmatic kind of pronouncements.
Sure.
But that will only take us so far. I think that also, probably urban spaces now have, there are going to be some very interesting questions to ask there, because, that is also something which has become less vivid artistically, I think, in the last few decades.
It's just the urban landscape.
Well, I mean, like a city like New York, for
Sure.
example, previously, in relatively recent memory, still had like a very vital cultural scene
Sure.
that was able to produce rock bands and painters and writers. And I don't know if that's really the case today.
Yeah, Max Foley has been commenting on that, like that it just seems incapable of producing any real music or art recently.
The lack of music, I think, is a particularly significant shortfall. I think, in general, you could say, well, rehearsal space is very expensive. Like the band actually has kind of dropped out of musical
just
production.
as an entity.
Yeah,
the band.
Like you get solo artists now, and it's much more industrialized.
Huh.
But there's something utopian about the band. I mean,
yeah,
like the way in which musicians come together to produce something collective. Actually,
and a band is a kind of space. I mean,
exactly.
It creates its own kind of space.
Exactly.
And really, I mean, I guess that kind of getting back to what we're doing here. I mean, the Wagon Box is like we're trying to build a really big band of writers, of sort of fringe academics and unprofessional thinkers, blue collar, sort of thoughtful blue collar guys, and a coalition of that type of people to do just the sort of thing you're talking about, to hone our ability to discuss things, our ability to be challenged and articulate the things that we believe. Is that something like the kind of spaces that you're talking about, the cultural spaces?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that ultimately these are cultural spaces. They're not just obviously physical, although they have a physical component. I mean, and ultimately it's a sort of spiritual space, which is created by a certain kind of concentration of energies and a kind of cross-pollination of energies, actually. And like the band is in a way the microcosm of the culture, because
it's like the minimum viable product of the cultural space.
Well, I mean, you can see also, like in that case, how one can be, let's say, playing in harmony or not. Know how the same group of people, like could be all very talented, but if the chemistry isn't correct, then it won't work. There's this kind of X factor, which is a little bit mysterious.
Sure.
And how do you create some kind of culture of possibility that then would enable, let's say, musicians or artists, or, to experiment productively or even discuss productively with each other? If you solve this problem, then you solve a lot of problems at the same time, actually.
Sure. Yeah, that's a problem I'm trying to solve. I'm wondering if we have the time to get into it. I really wanted to sort of get back to this idea of the West as a space and as a collection of spaces, and the question of the particular and the universal as this sort of central tension in the West's self-understanding. Do you think we can dive into this?
Well, I mean, I don't know, like if I can try and make an elegant segue, and consider the West in the first place as a space. This is something Spengler discusses, actually. I mean, the West also, its birth occurs with the formulation of a new concept of space, of infinite space, actually, compared to the closed world of the Greeks, for example. I mean, Spengler says, Western civilization, Faustian civilization, is not Greek civilization. Actually, it's on a fundamentally different cultural basis. A different kind of sense of space, sense of time, sense of self. So the West then becomes also this movable, expansionist concept, really. It is continually, in fact, moving west. It moves from Europe all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, which becomes a medium of transmission, and then through manifest destiny to California. And in a way, the West is, I think, now being reborn with the rebirth of the frontier in the form of space and the metapolitics of the
final frontier, you might say.
Right. Yeah. The metapolitics of that are extremely significant. The notion that we must colonize Mars. Like from an empirical point of view, it like doesn't necessarily make that much sense, although maybe they know things that we don't, you know. But as a Faustian culture, it's imperative that Western man is always
Eternally
attempting,
expanding.
must expand.
Is this now? Where is the roots of? I mean, I wonder the roots of this. It must have some kind of. I guess I'm thinking of like particular scripture verses. There's one that says, "To the increase of His kingdom there shall be no end." This in the Psalms. I wonder if it's the influence of scripture through Christianity, Old and New Testament, that sort of helped birth this infinite space idea.
Well, I mean, I think people situate the West differently. I mean, as I said, you know, Spengler distinguishes it from classical civilization, although obviously that does form an element in the West's composition.
Sure.
I think you can see, following the decline of Rome, you saw the beginnings of a new kind of form of synthesis with the sort of the Barbaro-Roman nations that ultimately emerged and became the nations of Europe. So in other words, what you saw happening there was a conjunction between something that was civilizational and something that was more particular and cultural in this respect. Like a tribe is a closed unit and a civilization is an open unit. So that marriage created then a certain kind of dynamism, which I think has continued to remain in the West and can be traced through the history of the West in all kinds of different ways. Without wishing to, let's say, open up this kind of worms either, I mean, you know, the history of the Jews in Europe is extremely representative of precisely that tension, concentrates it to a certain degree.
Sure.
Because actually Christianity itself was in a certain way a certain birth of universalism from a project that was more national in its origins. You know, and St. Paul in his letters is constantly polemicizing against actually Jews who are part of the Jesus movement at the time, and they're trying to argue
particularizing,
exactly. And this is what most of his attacks on Jews in letters are about. They're not the Jews per se; they're Jewish Christians. But again, this is another complex topic.
Of which category he was one. I mean, he was Jewish Christian, and I mean he's taking vows and shaving his head and doing different things, and he's still participating in those sort of things. So, but wrapping up here, because we don't have too much time, if you could, maybe just expand a little bit on that universal versus particular.
Well, I think that, you know, you could see, let's say, the dangers of either coming down on one side or the other. Like, it's somehow important to maintain this tension. If one becomes too universalist, then ultimately you begin to open up your whatever it is to influences that are not necessarily going to improve it. I mean, to return to the metaphor of the band, like the band may grow, but, you know, and then
band can't be everybody.
It can't be. Not everyone can be in the band. Like, the quality of the music will degrade. You know, then you know, okay, like this guy with his tambourine, yes, okay, this guy, you know, with his
nose flute or whatever.
I don't know. I mean, it's
accordion,
to blend these things together requires a certain kind of crystallization and particularity. It's necessary to maintain a certain kind of continuity. Otherwise, it just disintegrates. So, you know, on the other hand, you know, if you're not open to outside influences, then you run the risk of becoming very hermetic, closed off, sealed. You cease experimenting, you know, and then you die another kind of death. So I would say that, you know, the success of the West, I mean, to sort of propose this, I mean, it's kind of a very big theory, but it's, I think, to do with the fact that it's been able to maintain in a productive and dynamic way, you know, this tension between the particular and the universal. It has been able to retain elements of its culture while continually expanding the circle of its culture in a way that other civilizations have not been able to do as well. You know, I think that you can see many examples of extremely hermetically sealed cultures that were not able to adapt. I think you could see also cultures that kind of adapted too fast. Maybe, Rome was one of them, actually, which ultimately became something else than what it started as, because it was so somehow open to the outside that it lost its own foundations.
Yeah, we'll have to have another talk, because I'm curious how this plays into the idea of that we're talking that I think we might be moving towards, which would be what some call Turbo America, which would be a broad but light American empire that allows for a lot of local sovereignty and expression of particular in this sort of universal, much like the Roman Empire in its heyday, but hopefully better in many ways.
I think that the vision, the utopian vision, although it's not exactly utopian, because it's not aiming to achieve, let's say,
anything perfect,
but it's rather just to achieve the minimal viable system, let's say, that then enables pollination to occur. It recognizes the limitations ultimately of centralized political power. It's not creative, and it can't be. Like its job is to maintain a certain kind of minimal security, actually, that then enables people to experiment
on a sort of under that umbrella.
Exactly. So the United States has been obviously like extremely successful precisely following that model.
Sure, the federalist model, divided sovereignty.
So there was a lot of space in America, literally, for people to create their own kinds of visions of how they wanted to live, within the overarching framework of the Constitution as like minimal viable government. I mean, this was the plan.
That was the plan.
And, I think obviously every political structure also exists in time, and it is deformed and extended and shaped in different kinds of ways.
Evolves, yeah.
And I think we've been seeing, since probably FDR, massive expansion of the federal state. And now hopefully we're going to see its massive de-expansion.
And contraction.
And consequently the opening up of, all of the space that it was kind of occupying and not really using very well. And so it's like suddenly this sort of deafening syncretic sound, this sort of noise, this like chirping fire alarm of the state
that you don't really notice.
That you don't really
this is a good little analogy to end on. Is I bought a set for the first time. They were on sale. I was in the airport and I bought a set of noise canceling headphones in an airport. And when I put them in, it had not occurred to me just how loud an airport is. The walking and the squeaking and the kids hollering and the announcements going on. And you get used to all that noise. And when I put those headphones in, it was almost like this space opened up around me. And I could think and I could breathe, like, wow, I can really get some work done here. And so maybe that's what's going on now, is that there's a little bit of, hopefully, some quieting of that loud machine that we had all gotten used to. And maybe it'll open up some spaces for projects like the Wagon Box and many others, IM 776 and all sort of things to build and to grow and do something good.
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct. It's a noise is the question, and we want to make music, or we want to have nice conversations, let's say, and you can't do that if our attention is being perpetually distracted, unconsciously, even in ways that we don't realize.
Even especially unconscious.
And this has been a phenomenon of, again, like the past few decades. I mean, just so much noise. I mean, just like pathological material, really, that has no business being discussed in public, somehow becoming the center of political debate. In a way which is like as if there's nothing significant to discuss.
Right.
There aren't real political issues, or
noise.
Politics doesn't have to deal with realities, instead dealing with people's just private identitarian issues. It becomes preposterous, actually, after a while. There was, and it in a way itself is a symptom of, I think, a kind of failure of will, actually, like a refusal to face the problems,
the important things,
and therefore kind of escaping into minutiae.
Yeah,
I mean, I think from that point of view, maybe like this whole credentialed class, which were obviously incapable of doing their jobs, maybe they're a little bit grateful actually to finally
be relieved,
to finally
of
be
the
relieved
responsibility
of maintaining this, this pretense.
Well, that's an interesting note to end on. Thanks for tuning in here. And Daniel's gonna be here for a little while. He's doing a little residency here to work on some writing projects here at the Wagon Box. And if you're interested in escaping the noise and getting away somewhere quiet, reach out. We do writer and artist residencies here at the Wagon Box, and we'll be having more events and more conversations. And hopefully we'll get to talk again soon.
Yeah.
But it's good talking.
Pleasure.